What gets to be history? I think this is a helpful question, selfishly, for me to ask, only because I think I told you before, my strategy working with young people, urban Indigenous young people, was primarily to get their solutions, suggestions, and organizings into the mainstream media. Now, we all know there have been Google fighting the government, and the news fighting the government, and the news fighting the social media, and the government fighting the social media, and everyone's fighting everybody. To the point that now it's actually not that beneficial or helpful for us to be getting our activities into the mainstream news, because it doesn't make it onto the social network where it can disseminate as it previously did. And so, selfishly, I'm asking you what gets to be history so that I can take this knowledge and share it with Indigenous young people who are doing great work in our community, identifying and solving some of our reconciliation-related challenges so that they can be the history makers in the long term that they are today. So, what gets to be history? Does anybody want to go first?
Stories that are willing to be retold.
Stories that are willing to be retold. Great answer. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about that? Or that?
I'll let everybody.
Can I actually respond to that wording?
Yeah.
I'm holding that word willing and thinking back to Sandra's presentation this morning around the number of people in the TRC process who shared or who had already shared and so didn't share. And this notion of willing implies an audience. And I might be willing to say this in front of you all in a social context and a temporal context of where we've been together so far. I may not have been willing to say what I'm saying at 9 a.m. or with a different group of people or in a different context. So that I'm going to percolate on this.
It's the retold part. So like you tell us, or you're finally willing to tell your story, but are other people willing to retell it? Like that's, you're not.
Well, and these
two sides, yeah.
That's not, so like, somebody told a story, but will that story be retold or will it just be forgotten?
And I'm also fascinated by the wording that it's the stories themselves that hold agency.
And it's a story. It's a story as well. It's not necessarily facts.
I just drew three sick people here, the teller, the repeater, and the listener, because I think we're talking about all of them here.
Yeah.
I think this is totally that Wakoto in kinship relational. That similarly we were talking. Sorry, just around word choice. I stumbled, paused with, held with care. Your phrasing of gets to, because there's all kinds of power implied in there too. Gets implies allowed. Who is doing the get, and anyway, so all kinds of relational dynamics going on.
Yeah.
So maybe we need a fourth stick person who is the allower of the telling in the first place.
I feel like that's the job of the repeater.
Well, each person has the agency to stop or change the story. It is. I'm actually like, I just wrote this down on my notes, but I'm just like, it's a relationship across time.
Relationship across time? That was deep.
That's what that is. It's these three people that's a relationship across time. You got the teller. You could even say the experiencer, the teller, the repeater, the listener. And you could be any of those people at any time within the story of history.
The teller doesn't necessarily need to be the person who experienced it.
No.
And
It could
there's
be a
an
witness.
amplifier in that, right?
Ooh, that's a weird term. I am very much
Yes,
interested.
amplifier.
So if we have these four roles, we have history, is what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and without the amplifier, like stories are being told all the time, but which ones are being brought forward because of that amplification? I think that's where the gets to comes in, because if I'm thinking of Indigenous histories of these lands, they've always been there. They've always been getting told, but they're not typically featured, or they haven't been featured in textbooks and classrooms. because other stories have been amplified above and beyond them. It's not that they weren't told.
I added a new person of decider.
Mm.
All right, so there's the experiencer, the teller, the repeater, the listener, the decider. And all of these together are the allowers that make history.
And they can be in different spots, like this can be in the education system, in the media, in the kitchen,
Yep.
so in your family.
I feel like the decider is actually that position that's not in the line. I feel like there could be a decider next to the experience that like no one talks about this. There's the decider next to the teller that goes, we're gonna reword what you just said about that experience back there. There's the decider that can be like, no, we don't repeat it that way. There's the decider that can be like, you're not hearing it the way that we intend for you to hear it.
So we need a bunch of deciders.
Yeah,
We need deciders at
just
every
authority
stage.
in general. Yeah.
Interesting. But I have a, this sounds, looks like a clarifying hand.
No, it was attempted again. So I think there's hierarchies and there's levels of authority within each of those people, but then all of them are bathed in culture, right? So you take that from, and that culture can change on a temporal sense, but also on a geographic sense, right? So, if that happens in a particular community in Canada, then there's changes as to how that history happens. Likewise, that history 100 years ago, that culture will be different than today than in the future, right? So all this is happening in a context which I would call culture.
Cultural
It is
context
shifting.
is
It's not stagnant.
Always
ever evolving.
But it's not all even, like, you could say, okay, who are all those people at a certain point? If you're saying it's in white supremacist patriarchy, okay, so the teller is gonna be only white men. So the listeners are, like, people are situated differently. But then I think the history of residential schools is a good example. It's like enough kids who are survivors of residential school talk about their experiences, and suddenly that which might not have been hearable, sayable, allowed, totally makes and shifts history. And the whole TRC is a result of that. Like, and
These are all kind of things the TRC has done.
I think something to add is that with what you just made me think of is that facts and evidence helped. So facts and evidence do play a part in what gets to be history, but they don't necessarily tell the story. But facts and evidence are definitely something that helped history become more evident, or the truth become more evident with regard to that, right? Like before, when I was younger, residential schools were just a place where other people went to school, but the facts and evidence told a different story, or allowed us to understand differently, which then changed the history in a lot of schools. I don't know.
In that way, you could say facts and evidence fall into also almost it's not a replacement necessarily, but within the guise of the experience. Kind of like the physical elements of the experiencer's experience.
So I think what we're doing here is we're putting a bunch of important things in here that are not exactly in the right order.
Yeah.
And at some point we're going to reassemble all the stuff that I'm just capturing in the right order. Because I don't think I'm capturing it in the right order, but I think I'm just trying to capture these suggestions so that at a later time we can critically analyze them.
And suffering of nations,
Suffering of nations?
yes, makes history, and they're having to have changing their land. Nations fighting makes history.
You say change of land?
Yes.
What kind?
Like borders changing or stuff like that. So big events.
Changes.
So big,
Yeah, that-
big events that affect
Deaths of
large
millions,
populations.
yes, deaths of millions also.
Deaths of
Tears and suffering.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I want to add, like, ever since what you mentioned about when it's getting history, and also about facts and evidence, if these facts and evidence are published in literature, in legends, in some songs, that's also history because it's true. Not depends on some people from government yet, but depends on the just people who suffered, who contributed a lot, who took part in wars, etc. So it's literature.
Okay.
And also I totally agree about cultural context. So now in modern society, everyone can be a designer.
Yeah.
So I threw at the bottom there literature and stories because I think that that is so important. I'm going to put songs too.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we could continue on that way quite a bit. Does anyone have anything else that they want to say?
I think you should quote Paula.
Paula Abdul?
No, different Paula.
Straight
Apparently,
up.
a journalist who at one point said it was bastards and assholes. Make history like
Oh, that's a good
very,
one.
Yeah.
like ways that people who exert power often in negative ways, often people who aren't that appear in history when something awful happens to them.
But
So
that
it's
reminds me
actually
of
the
like one of my
moment of their like the hardest moment of their life. It's
Yeah.
what makes them legible, like in a newspaper record.
That also reminds me of like one of my favorite inspiring quotes, which is that well-behaved women rarely make history, right?
Well, I think
We're always told.
yeah,
Behave
like
well,
the
yeah.
kind of the gender, like the and
Yeah.
the bastard as a term and all that, like the gender
Yeah.
and that. I think it's part of what.
And you kind of get the idea, like, in order to make history, you have to have your voice heard, but then you also have to be listened to, because women who have tried to have their voice heard often weren't listened to and had to stand up and shout, and that goes across the board for every minority.
I just added to the end here events that impact large groups.
Yeah.
Well, just based on kind of. Do we have a suggestion here? What's that?
History.
History is cultural.
History is also cultural. I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that's exactly what I think we're trying to do.
The entire thing is cultural. Yeah. One of my
It really is.
podcasts is behind bastards.
Okay, so we've gotten a little bit into a messy kind of chaos about what gets to be history, but that was my whole intention here. I wanted to muddy the waters a little bit. And the reason I wanted to muddy the waters is because if we have to be confused as Indigenous people making history in Winnipeg, so do you.